That morning, Thao woke up with a strange feeling. When she opened her eyes, she looked out the window where the gentle rays of the morning sun shone down on the ground. However, an indescribable restlessness arose in her heart. Today was a special day, the day Thao had been waiting for a long time, an interview at the company she had always dreamed of joining, which opened up countless opportunities for career advancement. This was an opportunity not to be missed, a turning point that could completely change her life. Thao slowly sat up, gently smoothing her long hair that was a bit messy after sleeping. Looking in the mirror, she frowned slightly, not because she was surprised by her reflection, but because of a strange premonition that was rising in her heart. Her heart beat faster, not necessarily because of anxiety, but because of the feeling that something important was waiting ahead. Quickly getting ready, she chose an elegant white shirt combined with a tight black skirt, each step exuding a rare confidence. Despite her careful preparation, Thao still felt a vague unease that was difficult to put into words. When everything was ready, Thao turned her eyes to the dressing table, where there was a small box she always kept in the corner of the room. Inside was a pair of gold earrings, the only gift her adoptive mother, Mrs. Lei, had given her since she was a child. Simple, but with deep spiritual value, the earrings were associated with childhood memories. Mrs. Lee had once placed them in her hand and told her that this was a souvenir from a very beloved grandmother and would bring her confidence and luck no matter what difficulties she faced. Putting on the earrings, Thao looked at herself in the mirror, feeling a positive energy spreading, helping her calm down. Stepping out of the house, a sudden cold wind blew past, making her stop, not because of the cold, but because of a strange premonition that arose, as if something was about to happen. Not daring to think further, she quickly took a taxi to the company. Throughout the journey, Thao tried to stay calm, but everything around her seemed to become blurry. When the taxi stopped in front of the high-rise building, she looked up, clearly feeling the grandeur and majesty of the place she was about to enter. The luxury cars parked outside the gate further highlighted the picture of power, making her feel a little small. Although she had prepared carefully, when facing that space, Thao couldn't help but feel nervous. She took a deep breath, tried to regain her confidence, then walked into the large hall. The atmosphere here was full of concentration and determination, completely different from the outside world. Thao found a seat in the waiting room, trying to stay calm. Time seemed to drag on endlessly. Each passing second made her heart more tense. When it was her turn, she didn't expect that the interviewer was Mr. Kang, the group's chairman. When she raised her head to face him, Thao realized that his eyes stopped on the earrings she was wearing. His eyes were not as serious as usual, but rather filled with a strange surprise, as if he had just discovered something important. Thao's chest tightened, a feeling of unease welled up. Everything suddenly became vague, and she knew this interview would not go as she had expected. The door closed, the space fell silent. Mr. Kang's eyes seemed to penetrate, focusing on the earrings. "Can you tell me where those earrings came from?" he spoke, his voice low and determined. Poe paused a bit, hesitantly replied, "It's just a gift my adoptive mother gave me." Although she tried to maintain her confidence, she didn't understand why he was interested in this small object. But the strangest thing was his eyes, both doubtful and emotional. After a moment of silence, Mr. Kang said, "These earrings used to belong to my daughter." Thao was stunned, as if struck by lightning. "Your daughter?" she muttered, unable to believe what she had just heard. Mr. Kang, the powerful chairman she met for the first time, confirmed that the earring she was wearing belonged to his daughter, who had long since disappeared. A series of questions surged in her mind, but she didn't know where to start. Mr. Kang sighed, his eyes filled with sadness. "My daughter has been missing since she was 3 years old. This earring belonged to her. After the disappearance, I could not find any trace." Thao felt the world around her blurred. Jia. Bao, the name Mrs. Lei had accidentally mentioned, now echoed in her mind. "Can you help me find the truth?" Mr. Kang asked, his voice weak but full of hope. Thao choked, not knowing how to answer. Everything was too sudden, too unbelievable. Thao walked out of the interview room, her mind in turmoil by Mr. Kang's words. "My daughter." That sentence kept echoing in her head, like an indelible sound. She left the building, but the chaotic feeling still clung to every step. Her heart was pounding as if it wanted to break out of her chest. "Jiabao is me?" she wondered, her voice choked in her throat. She could not understand what was happening. The uneasiness from early morning was now more evident, like a warning she had ignored. Mrs. Lei, her foster mother, was the only person she had known since childhood, the one who had cared for and loved her for so many years. But now a mysterious door to the past was opening, and Mrs. Lei seemed to hold the key. Thao hurried home, her heart filled with anxiety. She needed answers, even if they might hurt her. As soon as she entered the door, she saw Mrs. Lei sitting in the living room, her face familiar yet slightly strange. Her eyes were hesitant as she looked at her, as if waiting for a question she did not want to answer. "Mom," Thao said, her voice trembling, uncertain of what she was about to ask, "do you know anything about the earring I wore today?" Mrs. Lei looked up, her eyes slightly confused. The room fell silent. Only Tao's rapid breathing echoed. "Does that earring mean anything to you?" she asked, her voice starting to lose patience. Mrs. King's words were still disturbing her mind, making her unable to bear the ambiguity any longer. Mrs. Lee took a deep breath, her hands clenched as if trying to suppress her emotions. She slowly stood up, approached Thao, and placed her hand on her shoulder. But instead of a clear explanation, she just sighed, her voice sad. "That's something I've kept for a long time. You don't need to think too much about it." Thao felt her heart tighten. Those words were too vague, like a wall between her and the truth. "But I feel something is wrong." She hesitated, then blurted out, "That earring. Mr. Kang said it belonged to his daughter, the girl who went missing 21 years ago." Mrs. Le suddenly turned around, her eyes becoming cold. "Stop asking, Thao. Those things have nothing to do with you." Her voice was high-pitched, full of tension. Thao was stunned, as if she had been hit hard. For the first time, she saw Mrs. Lei, the gentle foster mother who had always protected her, change so much. Confusion and fear welled up in her heart. What was she hiding? Why did she react so strongly? Mrs. Lee turned around but did not look into her eyes. Her gaze was lost in space, as if she were lost in another world. Thao felt an invisible pain piercing her heart. She loved her foster mother, but the feeling of being deceived was unbearable. "Mom, you have to tell me clearly," she screamed, unable to contain her emotions. "I can't live in the dark forever." Mrs. Lei looked at her, her eyes filled with fatigue. "You don't understand, Thao," she said with a sigh. "I kept everything for you. If you knew the truth, you wouldn't be you anymore." Thao was stunned, unable to ask any more questions. She turned around and walked out the door, not knowing where to go or what to do. Mrs. Lei's words were like a big wound in her heart. She couldn't ignore this. The truth, no matter how painful, she had to find out. That night, Thao couldn't sleep. Mrs. Lei's words repeated in her head, making her unable to live with the feeling of confusion about her own past. She decided to take action, to find out about the disappearance that Mr. Kang had mentioned. The next morning, Thao went to the library where old documents that could reveal clues were kept. Every step she took was like walking down a foggy path, but she had no other choice. Mrs. Lei had refused to explain, and the truth was now the only thing she craved. In the archive area, she sat in front of the computer, typing in the keywords Tran Jia Bao and the disappearance 21 years ago. The screen lit up, displaying old articles. A headline caught her eye: "The mysterious disappearance of Tran Jiabao, daughter of the chairman of Donghai Group." Her heart was pounding. The article was about a disappearance that happened in the summer of 1999, when Jiabao was only 3 years old. She disappeared right in the Tran family's yard, and the police couldn't find any trace of her. The family lived in the pain of loss for many years, and no one could answer the question, "My daughter?" Xiao sat there, unable to take her eyes off the screen. The name Jia Bam repeated over and over in her head. Was she really Mr. Kong's daughter? Everything she had ever known about herself suddenly became vague. She continued reading, and a detail startled her. An anonymous source revealed that Mr. Kong had received threats before his daughter went missing. "Threatening?" Thao muttered. "Who is behind this kidnapping?" Unable to sit still, she stood up, determined to find answers from the source. She called Mr. Kong the first time after the interview. "You want to see me? Is there something important?" His voice was deep and cold over the phone. "Mr. Kong, I need to know the truth. Is there anything related to Jia Bao's disappearance that you haven't told me?" Thao said, unable to hide her excitement. After a moment of silence, Mr. Kang replied, "We will meet at the company tomorrow, but I'm not sure if you are ready to hear what I have to say." His words were like a rock pressing down on her chest. However, Thao could not give up. She had to face the truth, no matter where it led her. The next day, Thao returned to the Donghai Group building, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. This time, she entered with a different determination, no longer afraid, but determined to face the truth. When she entered Mr. Kang's office, the atmosphere was tense. He sat behind his desk, his eyes solemn but filled with fatigue, as if years of suffering had left deep marks on his face. "Here," Mr. Kang said, his voice low but no longer cold as before. Thao nodded, sat down without saying anything. A series of thoughts swirled in her head like a storm, but she didn't know where to start. "You know everything, right?" Mr. Kang broke the silence, his voice full of hesitation. "I guess you met Mrs. Huinglan." Thao looked at him, her eyes both tense and worried. "Yes, I met her. She told me everything," she replied, pausing for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Kong, I'm your daughter, right?" Mr. Kong was silent, his eyes looking far away, as if searching through his memories. The room fell silent. Only the sound of Tao's strong heartbeat echoed in her chest. Finally, he spoke. "Yes, you are my daughter. My daughter went missing when she was very young. But when I met you, when I looked into your eyes, I knew that you were Jia Bao. I can no longer deny this." His voice was not weak, but it contained a deep sadness. I have searched for you for so many years, but I never thought that you would return in this form. Thao did not know how to react. His words were like a dream that she could not wake up from. Too surprising, too difficult to accept. Why? She asked, her voice trembling, tears welling up. Why didn't you find me sooner? You let me live in a family that was not my biological family, with people who were not my parents. Mr. Kong stood up, approaching her. His emotions were like a fierce wave that swept her away. I could do nothing when Miss Huanglan acted like that, he said, his voice choking. I couldn't protect you. That's what I've regretted all these years. Thao looked at him, her heart filled with anger and pain. She wanted to blame him, but the words she had just heard made her speechless. What had Mrs. Huanglan, that name was like a ghost in this story, done to put her in this situation? She was so tired of everything. So what should I do now? She asked, her eyes full of hurt. Who am I? I don't know who I am anymore. Mr. Kong lowered his head, his eyes as if he was searching for an answer for himself. I will do everything to make it up to you, he said. But the important thing is that you have to find yourself again. You have to decide what you want. Thao stood up, feeling like she couldn't bear it any longer. Everything was too vague, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't live in the past forever, couldn't be a forgotten child forever. I don't know where I'm going, but I can't stand still, she said, then turned and walked out. The office door closed behind her, leaving a heavy silence. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't let anyone control her life anymore. Out of the building, Thao stood in the middle of the crowd, but everything around her seemed to be spinning. Her heart was pounding, as if it was about to burst. What Mr. Kang said, what Ms. Ho Lan revealed, it was all too hard to accept. She couldn't imagine being caught up in such a mess. Suddenly, she stopped on a deserted road, her eyes looking forward, but seeing only confusion. She had lived a different life, not knowing about her true past. But now, everything had changed. She was no longer the innocent child in her adoptive mother's arms, nor was she completely Jia Bao, Mr. Kang's daughter. She was just herself, a person lost among the secrets that had just been revealed. A cold wind blew past, pulling her from her thoughts. She realized she couldn't stand there forever. The truth, no matter how painful, she had to face it. As soon as she got home, the phone rang. Thao startled and looked at the screen. It was Mr. Kang. Anxiety welled up, but she still pressed the answer button. Do you still remember me? His voice was no longer cold as before, but as if he was trying to reach her. I know things are very chaotic for you, but I can't let you go without my help. Thao was silent, not knowing how to respond. She felt like she was being pushed into a situation with no way out. You want to help me? She asked, her voice full of doubt. What can you do to help me when everything has changed? I know you're suffering, Mr. Kang replied, his voice low and full of emotion, but you're not alone. I'll help you learn about your past. I'll help you clear things up. And whoever you are, I want you to know that I'll always be here, never giving up. Thao felt her heart tighten. She didn't want to admit it, but Mr. Kang was right. Whoever he was, whatever mistakes he had made in the past, he was still her father, the only person left who could help her find the truth. After a moment of silence, she asked, what will you do? How will you help me when it's too late? Can you find back what's been lost? I don't know if the past can be changed, Mr. Kang admitted, his voice heavy, but I know we can't live with secrets and pain forever. If you want to find yourself, I'll go with you. We'll find the truth about everything. His words were like a small ray of light in Tao's heart. She didn't know where she was going or what she was going to do, but for the first time, she felt a little hopeful. Maybe Mrs. Huanglan would continue to threaten her, but she didn't let fear stop her anymore. The next morning, Thao decided to meet Mr. Kang again. She had prepared herself for every possibility, even though she didn't know where the truth would lead her. When she entered his office again, the air was as cold as yesterday, but this time she no longer felt afraid. She was ready to face everything. Mr. Kang stood up when he saw her enter, his eyes showing worry, but also determination. You've come, he said, his voice low, no longer distant like the first time they met. Yes, Thao replied, her voice firm. I'm ready. Let's get started. Mr. Kang nodded, signaling her to sit down. We have to find what was lost from the smallest clues, things that can help you get your life back, he said, his voice serious but full of will. Thao sat down, feeling like a new chapter in her life was about to open. Just she didn't know where this journey would take her, but she understood that ahead was an opportunity to discover herself, even if it meant facing painful or unwanted things. I met Mrs. Huanglan, Thao began, her voice calm but her eyes flashing with tension. She admitted that she was behind my kidnapping because she was jealous of the affection you had for your daughter. She said that if she didn't do it, I would just be a toy in your hands. She called the life I had a gift she gave me. Mr. Kong fell silent, his hands clenched on the table. His eyes darkened as if painful memories were flooding back. Mrs. Huilan, he muttered, his voice low. I didn't expect her to go this far. I used to love her, but when Jia Bao was born, everything changed. She couldn't accept my affection for my daughter. Thao felt a chill run down her spine. Then why didn't you do anything to stop her? Why did you let me be kidnapped and live a lie for 21 years? She asked, unable to hide her anger. Mr. Kong sighed, bowing his head as if he were bearing an invisible burden. I didn't know she planned it, he said, his voice choking. When Giavar went missing, I did everything to find him, hired a detective, asked the police, even faced threats, but there were no clues. I didn't expect her to be the one behind it all. Thao looked at him, her heart torn. What about Mrs. Li? What does my foster mother know about this? She asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Kang looked up, his eyes slightly surprised. Mrs. Li, I'm not sure how much she knows. When I met you at the interview and saw the earrings, I was suspicious, but I don't have clear evidence of Mrs. Li's role. Did you ask her? Thao nodded, her voice low. Foster mother said she kept me because she wanted to protect me. She was afraid that if I knew the truth, I would leave her. But she didn't explain clearly why she adopted me or how she got me. Mr. Kang pondered for a moment, then said, maybe we need to see Mrs. Lei again. She's the only one who can clarify the rest of the story. Thao fell silent, thinking about his suggestion. She wasn't sure she was ready to face her adoptive mother again, the person she had once trusted so much, but who was now a big question mark in her life. I'll go with you, she finally said, but I need you to promise me that, whatever the truth is, you won't hide it from me anymore. I promise, Mr. King replied, his eyes determined. I've lost you once, I won't let it happen again. His words were like a small ray of light, piercing the thick fog in Tao's heart. She nodded, standing up. Then let's go now, she said, her voice firm. She didn't want to delay any longer. Each minute that passed only made her feel more suffocated by this mystery. On the way to Mrs. Lei's house, Thao sat next to Mr. Kang in the car, her heart filled with tension. She didn't know what this meeting would bring, but she could feel one thing clearly. The truth was getting closer. When the car stopped in front of the familiar house, Thao took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Mr. Kong put his hand on her shoulder as if in silent encouragement. The two of them walked into the house, and Mrs. Lei was sitting in the living room, her eyes slightly panicked when she saw them together. Thao and Mr. Kang, Mrs. Lei spoke, her voice trembling. Why did you two come here together? Thao stepped forward, her eyes determined. Mom, we need to talk. I need to know the truth, all the truth. How did you adopt me? Why do you have those earrings? And what do you know about my disappearance? Mrs. Lei turned pale, her hands shaking. She looked at Mr. Kang, then back at Thao, as if she were struggling internally, then asked as if she were trying. After a moment of silence, she sighed, her voice weak. Okay, I will tell you everything, but you have to promise not to hate me. Thao nodded, although she was not sure she could keep that promise. Mrs. Li sat down and began to tell. 21 years ago, I worked as a maid in Mrs. Huang Lan's house. One day, I accidentally heard her talking about the plan to kidnap Jia Bao, Mr. Kang's daughter. I didn't know what to do, but when she gave the child to a stranger to hide, I secretly followed. That person abandoned you on a street corner, and I couldn't leave you there. I took you home and raised you like my own child. The earrings were the only thing left on you at that time. Thao stood still, speechless. Mr. King clenched his hands, his eyes red. So you saved her? He asked, his voice choked. Mrs. Lei nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I didn't dare tell the truth because I was afraid that Mrs. Huanglan would find out. She is a powerful person and I'm just an ordinary person. I was afraid of losing Thao, afraid of losing her again. Thao felt like the world around her was collapsing. Her foster mother was not a bad person, but her silence had kept her living a lie for years. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice breaking. I was scared, Mrs. Lei replied, looking at her with pained eyes. I was scared that you would return to Mr. Kang and forget me. I just wanted to keep you by my side. Thao turned away, tears falling. She didn't know whether to forgive or blame. It was all too confusing, too painful. Thao stood still, feeling as if all the strength in her body had been drained. Mrs. Lei's words were like a tidal wave that swept away everything she had ever believed in. She looked at her adoptive mother, the woman who had raised her for 21 years, with a look of mixed pain and confusion. Mr. Kang, standing next to her, was also silent, his hands clenched as if trying to contain his emotions. The small room suddenly became stifling, with only the heavy breathing of three people facing a painful past. Why didn't you find a way to tell my father? Thao finally spoke, her voice trembling but unable to hide her indignation. If you knew I was Jia Bao, why didn't you let me return to my real family? Mrs. Le lowered her head, tears silently falling onto her skinny hands. I had no choice, Thao, she replied, her voice weak. At that time, Mom was just a poor maid. Mrs. Hoin Lan was a powerful person. She could do anything to shut Mom up. Mom was afraid that if she revealed the truth, she would find you and hurt you again. Mom just wanted to protect you. Mr. Kong stepped forward, his eyes red but still calm. Mrs. Lei, I don't blame you for saving her, he said, his voice low but full of emotion. But for 21 years, I have lived with the pain of losing my child. If you had spoken out sooner, maybe things would have been different. Mrs. Lay looked up, looking at him with apologetic eyes. I know I was wrong, but I didn't have the courage. I was afraid of losing Thao, afraid of losing the only person I considered family. I just wanted to keep her safe, even if that meant living in secret. Thao turned her face away, not wanting them to see her tears fall. She understood Mrs. Le's fear, but the fact that her life had been built on a lie made it hard for her to forgive. You protected me, but you also took away the chance for me to know who I was, she said, her voice breaking. I lived without knowing anything about my past, without knowing who my father was, without knowing myself. Mrs. Lay sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Thao. I just want you to be happy. Mr. Kang put his hand on Chao's shoulder, as if to give her strength. Chao, I can't change the past, he said, but I'm here now. I'll do everything I can to make up for the years you lost. Whether you accept me or not, you're still my daughter. Thao looked at him, her heart aching. She didn't know how to feel about the father who suddenly appeared in her life. He was part of her blood, but also a stranger with more than 2 decades between them. She stepped out onto the porch, needing space to think. The cold wind blew, carrying with it a sense of loneliness that enveloped her. Everything she had believed in, her family, her identity, her life, was now like a shattered picture. Mrs. Led had saved her, but she had also hidden the truth from her. Mr. Kang was her father, but he could not protect her from what had happened. And Mrs. Hong Lang, the evil woman behind it all, was still a ghost she had yet to face directly. After a while, Thao returned to the living room. Mrs. Lay and Mr. Kang were still standing there, their eyes waiting for her reaction. I can forgive you right now, she told Mrs. Lay, her voice calm but firm. I understand what you did for me, but I need time to accept this. Mrs. Lay nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I don't dare expect you to forgive me right away. As long as you don't hate me, that's enough. Thao turned to Mr. Kang. And you? I don't know what to call you. Father? Or just a stranger who just came into my life. But I want you to help me find the truth. All the truth. I need to know what Ms. Huang Lan did and why. Mr. Kang nodded, his eyes determined. I will do it. Ms. Huang Lan must pay for what she did. I will not leave you alone in this matter. Thao took a deep breath, feeling as if a burden had been lifted, even if only a small part. She knew the journey ahead would not be easy. Facing Mrs. Huang Lan, the person who had destroyed her life, was inevitable. But this time, she was no longer a lost girl. She had Mr. Kang by her side, and even though her relationship with Mrs. Lay was crumbling, she could still feel her adoptive mother's love for her. Where do we start? She asked Mr. Kang, her voice firm. He looked at her, his eyes shining with hope. From Mrs. Huang Lan, he replied. She is at the center of everything. I have some old documents and connections that can help us find out where she is. But you have to be prepared. She is not an easy person to deal with. Thao nodded. I am ready. I do not want to live in the dark anymore. As they left Mrs. Lay's house, Thao and Mr. Kang got into the car. She looked out the window, her heart filled with determination. Mrs. Hoanglan might have taken away her past, but she would not let her take away her future. The upcoming meeting would be a turning point, a chance for her to reclaim what was hers. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she was no longer alone. Mr. Kang sat beside her, silent but steadfast, as if he were a promise that he would accompany her to the end of this road. It was starting to get dark, but in Tao's heart, a small fire had been kindled. She was no longer a victim of fate. She was Thao, and perhaps also Jiao Bao, a person willing to face all secrets to find herself. On the way, Thao sat silently next to Mr. Kang, her eyes looking out the car window. The city lights passed by, blurred like her mind at this moment. She did not know what the confrontation with Mrs. Honglan would bring, but she was certain of one thing. This was the final step to clarifying her past. Mr. Kang broke the silence. I contacted an old friend, a detective who helped me investigate your disappearance years ago. He may be able to provide information about Miss Honglan's whereabouts. I'll turn to him, her eyes shining with curiosity and determination. Do you think she will tell the truth after all she has done? Mr. Kang sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Ms. Huanglan is unpredictable, but I know she cannot hide forever. If we have evidence, she will have to face it. Bao nodded, although she still had some doubts. Ms. Honglan was not only the one behind the kidnapping, she was also the one who built a secret network to hide her crimes for more than 2 decades. The car stopped in front of a small coffee shop where Mr. Kang had arranged to meet the detective. When they entered, a middle-aged man with gray hair was sitting in a hidden corner, a cold cup of coffee in front of him. He stood up when he saw them, his eyes sharp but friendly. Mr. Kang, long time no see, the man said, then looked at Thao. And this must be the girl in the story. Mr. Kang nodded, introducing. This is Thao, my daughter. Thao, this is Mr. Min, the one who helped me find you all these years. Thao shook Mr. Min's hand, feeling like another piece of the past had just appeared. Thank you for not giving up, she said, her voice sincere. Mr. Min smiled slightly. I only regret not finding you sooner. But now you're here and we have a chance to clear things up. He sat down, taking an old document from his briefcase. This is what I gathered about Miss Huanglan after her disappearance. She left the city shortly after, living under a different name. She is currently living in a villa in the suburbs, about 2 hours' drive away. Mr. Kang looked through the document, his brows furrowed. She lives that secretively? I always thought she was abroad. Mr. Min shook his head. No, she's closer than you think. But she's very careful, not communicating much, not showing herself in public. I suspect she knows you'll find out sooner or later. Thao listened to every word, feeling tension rising in her heart. So what are we going to do? Suddenly show up and confront her? She asked. Mr. Mint nodded. That's the only way. But we need to prepare. I have a recording from an old witness who used to work for Ms. Huanglan. This person said that she paid them to keep quiet about the kidnapping. If we bring this evidence, she won't be able to deny it. Mr. Kang looked at Thao as if to confirm her opinion. What do you think, Thao? Do you want to face her? Thao took a deep breath, her voice determined. I have to do it. I need to hear her admit what happened with her own mouth. After the meeting, Thao and Mr. Kang got into the car, heading towards Ms. Huanglan's villa. Throughout the journey, she held tightly onto the document Mr. Min gave her, as if it were her only weapon to demand the truth. When the car stopped in front of a large house in the middle of the suburban forest, Thao felt the coldness emanating from this place. The iron gate was silent, but the light from the window showed that there was someone inside. Mr. King rang the bell, and after a few minutes, a middle-aged woman opened the door. When she saw them, she paused, her eyes filled with panic. Where is Mrs. Huanglan? Mr. Kong asked, his voice firm. The woman stepped back, stammering. She's in the living room, but she doesn't want to see anyone. Thao stepped forward, her eyes determined. Tell her that Jia Bao is back. She will want to see me. The woman hesitated, then led them inside. When she entered the living room, Thao saw Mrs. Huanglan sitting on the armchair, her appearance haughty but her eyes cold. She looked at her, then at Mr. Kang, a smirk appearing on her face. Jia Bao? Mrs. Huanglan spoke, her voice sarcastic. I didn't expect you to come here. And Mr. Kang, can't you let go of the past? Thao stepped forward, not letting her arrogance deter her. You know who I am, she said, her voice firm. You kidnapped me, hid me for 21 years. I want to hear you admit it with your own mouth. Mrs. Huanglan sneered, but her eyes were filled with uncertainty. Do you have any evidence to dare to say that to me? Mr. Kong put the documents and the recorder on the table. We have everything. Witness statements, recordings of you paying to cover up the kidnapping. You can't hide anymore, Huanglan. She looked down at the table, her smile fading. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Huanglan looked up, her voice hoarse. Okay. I admit it. I ordered the kidnapping of the girl. I can't stand the fact that Mr. Kong loves her more than me. I want him to suffer like I did. Thao felt her heart tighten. Mrs. Huanglan's confession was like a stab, but at the same time, it was also the key to freeing her from suspicion. You did it all out of jealousy? She asked, her voice trembling. You took my life just because of your selfish feelings? Mrs. Huanglan looked at her, her eyes cold. I don't regret it, she replied. But if you want revenge, then do it. I have nothing left to lose. Mr. Kane grabbed Tao's hand, stopping her as she tried to step forward. That's enough, Thao, he said. She will pay, but not this way. We will let the law handle it. Thao nodded, although her heart was still filled with indignation. She turned and walked out of the room, not wanting to look at Mrs. Huanglan any longer. Outside, the cold air of the forest enveloped her, but this time, she felt relieved. The truth had been revealed, and despite the pain, she knew she had found a part of herself again. On the way back, Thao looked at Mr. Kang. What now? She asked. He smiled softly. For the first time, she saw warmth in his eyes. Now, it's time for us to rebuild, not just for you, but for both of us. Thao nodded, feeling like a new chapter was truly beginning. As the car rolled away from Mrs. Huanglan's villa, Thao sat silently, her eyes fixed on the window. The rows of trees darkened in the sunset, as if closing a painful chapter in her life. Mrs. Huanglan's confession still echoed in her head, cold, without remorse. But instead of anger, Thao felt a strange emptiness. She had come face to face with the person behind it all, but the truth did not bring the joy she had imagined. It only left a bigger question. Where would she go from here? Mr. Kang glanced at her, his voice low but gentle. Are you okay, Thao? She turned back, nodding slightly. I don't know how I feel, she admitted. Everything is over, but I still feel lost. Mr. Kane sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. I understand. The truth doesn't always bring immediate peace, but at least now you know who you are. That's the first step, Thao mused. Jia Bao, she muttered. I'm still not used to that name. I've lived my whole life as Thao, a person with no clear past. Now that I know I'm your daughter, I don't know what to do with it. Mr. Kang smiled slightly, his eyes shining with patience. You don't have to change right away. You can be Thao, Jiabao, or both. The important thing is that you have the freedom to choose, something you haven't had for the past 21 years. His words made Thao think. Freedom. A simple but heavy word. She had been imprisoned in a lie for years, not by chains, but by the silence of those around her. Now that the veil of secrecy had been lifted, she had the chance to reshape her life. But first, she needed to resolve an unfinished business, her relationship with Mrs. Lee. When the car stopped in front of Mrs. Lee's house, Thao took a deep breath. I need to talk to my foster mother, she said to Mr. Kang. Can you wait for me? He nodded, his eyes full of sympathy. I'll be here. Just do whatever you need. Thao got out of the car, her heart heavy. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she couldn't let things end in tension and misunderstanding. When she entered the house, Mrs. Lee was sitting at the dining table, her hands clasped together, her eyes worried. Seeing Thao, she stood up, her voice trembling. Thao, you're back. I thought you wouldn't come back. Thao approached, her eyes calm but determined. I need to talk to you, she said. I just met Mrs. Huang Lan. She admitted everything. The kidnapping, why she did it, I know the truth, but I still need to hear it from you. What were you thinking when you kept me with you all these years? Mrs. Kang sat down, tears rolling down her cheeks. I don't know what to say to make you forgive me, she began, her voice choking. When I brought you back, all I could think about was keeping you safe. I had no children, no family. You were everything to me. I knew I was selfish in hiding you from Mr. Kang, but I was afraid of losing you. I was afraid you would go back to him and forget me. Thao listened, her heart softening a little. I don't hate you, Mom, she said, her voice soft but firm. I understand what you did because you loved me. But you also have to understand that your silence has made me live a lie. I need time to accept this. But I don't want to cut off my relationship with you. Mrs. Lee looked up, her eyes shining with hope. Are you telling the truth? I just hope you don't turn your back on me. Thao nodded, though there was still a void in her heart that could not be filled. I won't turn my back. But from now on, I want to live true to myself. I need to find out who I am, not just Dao to you, but also Jia Mao to Mr. Kang. Mrs. Le smiled through her tears, holding her hand. I will support you. No matter what you choose, I will always be here. As she left the house, Thao felt lighter. She got into the car and looked at Mr. Kang. I talked to my foster mother, she said. We still need time, but I think everything will be fine. Mr. Kang nodded, his eyes warm. I'm glad you did that. Now, where do you want to go? Thao thought for a moment, then replied, I want to go to the company where it all began. I need to think about the future. On the way to Donghai Group, Thao reflected on her journey. From a nervous girl preparing for an interview, she had become someone facing the deepest secrets of her life. When she entered the company's grand lobby, she no longer felt small in the face of its grandeur. She had overcome her fear, and now she was ready to face anything. Mr. Kang walked beside her, his voice low but full of pride. You know, Thao, I have always dreamed of the day when I would see my daughter standing here, not as a candidate, but as part of this family. Thao looked at him, smiling slightly. I am still not used to calling you father, but I think we can start over, step by step. Mr. Kang nodded, his eyes shining. Step by step, he repeated. Standing in front of the large window overlooking the city, Thao felt a new wind in her heart. Mrs. Huanglan would have to face the law. Mrs. Le was still a part of her life, and Mr. Kang, the father she had never known, was now her companion. She was no longer a victim of the past. She is Dao, Tiabao, and above all, she is herself, a woman ready to continue writing her own story. The next day, Thao woke up in her familiar room, but the feeling was completely different. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, shining on the pair of gold earrings placed on the table, the souvenir that had once been the source of all the mysteries in her life. She picked it up, looking at it for a moment. The pair of earrings was no longer a mere piece of jewelry, but a symbol of the past, of loss and reunion. She smiled slightly, put it back on the table, and then prepared for a new day. The first day she officially entered Donghai Group, not only as a candidate, but as the daughter of the chairman. When she arrived at the company, Mr. Kang was already waiting in the main hall. He was wearing a neat suit. His eyes lit up when he saw her enter. Are you ready, Thao? He asked, his voice warm. Thao nodded, although she was still a little nervous. I'm not sure how well I'll do, she admitted. I never thought I'd be in this position. Mr. Kang put his hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of trust. You don't have to be good from the start. What I need is for you to learn and grow. I believe you can do it. They walked up to the top floor of the building where the chairman's office was located. When the door opened, Thao was amazed by the large space with a panoramic view of the city. A desk was placed next to Mr. Kang's, as if to confirm that she was now a part of this place. This is your place, he said, pointing to the desk. I want you to start by learning about the company, how we operate, the projects we're working on. You can work with me, step by step. Thao sat down, feeling both strange and excited. She opened the document Mr. Kang gave her and started reading about the history of Donghai Group, a business empire built from scratch by him, but also associated with the years he lived with the pain of losing his child. She realized that, in a way, his journey and hers had now intersected. "Did you build all this by yourself?" she asked, her eyes filled with admiration. Mr. Kong smiled, but his eyes were a little sad. "Not really. I did it to forget the pain. But now, I have a reason to continue. Because of you." The morning passed with brief meetings and discussions. Thao listened to Mr. Kong explain business strategies, feeling his dedication in every word. Even though she was just starting out, she did not feel as lost as she had feared. Mr. Kong was not only a father, but also a teacher, patiently guiding her through every detail. At lunchtime, he suggested, "How about we go get some lunch together? I want to hear your thoughts about today." They went to a small restaurant near the company, where the quiet atmosphere helped Thao feel more comfortable. When the food was served, she looked at Mr. Kang, hesitantly asking, "Have you ever thought about finding my mother, my biological mother, after I went missing?" Mr. Kang paused, his eyes darkening. "Your mother? She passed away not long after you went missing," he replied, his voice choked. She couldn't handle the shock. "I lost the two most important people in my life in just a few short years." Thao was silent, feeling like an old wound had just been touched. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I don't know." Mr. Kang shook his head, smiling sadly. "It's okay. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I just want you to understand that no matter how painful the past was, I always hope to find you again one day." Thao nodded, feeling the sincerity in his words. She couldn't change what was lost, but she could build what remained with him. That afternoon, Thao returned to the company with a new spirit. She started working on a small project that Mr. Kang had assigned her, a plan to expand the market to a new area. Although she still had much to learn, she felt excited about the challenge. When the workday ended, Mr. Kang walked over, looking at her with satisfaction. "You did better than I thought," he said. "Tomorrow, I will introduce you to the management team. I want them to know that you are not only my daughter, but also a part of the company's future." Thao smiled, feeling for the first time that she truly belonged here. "Thank you," she said. "I will try." Mr. Kang nodded, then added, "You don't have to call me sir forever. If you want, call me father when you are ready." Thao looked at him, her heart warming. "I will try, Dad," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. Mr. Kong smiled, his eyes shining with simple joy. When she left the company, Thao decided to visit Mrs. Lei. She wanted her foster mother to know that she was gradually finding her way. When she entered the house, Mrs. Lei was sitting knitting. Her eyes lit up when she saw her. "Thao, are you okay?" she asked, her voice worried. Thao sat down next to her, holding her hand. "I'm okay, Mom. I started working at Mr. Kang's company, my dad's. I want you to know that I still need you in my life, even though everything has changed." Mrs. Lei smiled, tears rolling down her face. "I'm glad you found your place. Whether you are Thao or Jiabao, you are still my daughter." Thao hugged her, feeling the familiar warmth. She knew that no matter how painful the past was, she still had two important people by her side, Mr. Kong and Mrs. Lei, each playing a different role in her journey to find herself. That night, Thao stood by the window, looking down at the city shining with lights. She was no longer the nervous girl before the interview. She had overcome the darkness of the past to step into the light of the present. Although the journey ahead was still full of challenges, she knew she was strong enough to face them. With a pair of gold earrings in hand, she told herself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The following weeks at Donghai Group passed at a fast pace. Thao gradually got used to the work, from processing documents to attending strategy meetings with Mr. Kang. Every day, she learned something new, not only about business, but also about herself. She discovered that she had sharp, analytical skills and patience beyond expectations. Mr. Kang often observed her, his eyes shining with pride whenever she gave a sharp idea or completed a difficult task. One afternoon, as they were reviewing financial reports, Mr. Kang suddenly asked, "Thao, have you ever thought about taking over this company?" Thao looked up, surprised. "Taking over? I never thought I was capable," she replied, her voice a little hesitant. Mr. Kong smiled, putting down his pen on the table. "I'm not saying right now, but you're my daughter, the only person I want to entrust what I've built. I'm not forcing you, but I want you to consider it. This is not just a company, it's our family legacy." His words made Thao pause. She had never imagined herself in that position. A girl who had known nothing of the past, now given the opportunity to lead an empire. "I'll think about it," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "But if I do it, I want to do it my way. Not just to continue, but to create something new." Mr. Hang nodded, satisfied. "That's what I expected. You have your mother's spirit, strong and creative." At the same time, Thao and Ms. Lei's relationship gradually healed. She often visited her foster mother on weekends, bringing stories about her work and new life. Mrs. Lei listened, her eyes shining with joy as she watched her grow up. One time when the two were sitting drinking tea in the small yard, Mrs. Lei suddenly said, "I have something for you." She took a small silver necklace from her pocket, old but carefully preserved. "This is something I bought for you when you were little, but never gave it to you. I think now is the right time." Thao took the necklace, feeling the warmth of Mrs. Lei's hand. "Thank you, Mom," she said, her voice choking. "I will keep it like I kept the earrings." Mrs. Lei smiled, holding her hand. You don't have to choose between me and Mr. Kang. We are both your family in our own way. Thao nodded and hugged her. She realized that no matter how complicated the past was, Mrs. Lei's love for her was real, and that was something she would always cherish. Meanwhile, Mrs. Huanglan's case also came to an end. With evidence from Mr. Min and a direct confession, she was brought to trial. At the trial, Mrs. Huanglan remained arrogant, but her eyes no longer held the same challenge as before. The court sentenced her to 20 years in prison for kidnapping and conspiracy to conceal a crime. When she heard the verdict, Thao sat in the audience, next to Mr. Kang. She did not feel gloating, but only a quiet relief. She paid the price, she told Mr. Kang as she left the court. He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Justice does not erase the past, but it gives us the opportunity to move forward. As time passed, Thao became more and more confident in her new role at the company. A year later, she was officially appointed as the CEO of a major project, the first step in preparing for her future takeover of the group. During the announcement ceremony, Mr. Kang stood on stage, introducing her to all the employees. This is Thao, or Jiabao, my daughter, he said, his voice full of pride. She is not only the heir, but also the one who will take Donghai to new heights. Applause rang out, and Thao stepped forward, smiling with a confidence she had never had before. After the ceremony, Thao returned home carrying a bouquet of flowers that her colleagues had given her. She placed it on the table next to a pair of gold earrings and a silver bracelet from Mrs. Lei. Looking at those three small objects, she felt the long journey she had traveled from a lost girl to a woman who knew who she was. The phone rang, and Mr. Kang's voice rang out. I am proud of you, Thao. Today is a special day. She smiled and replied, Me too, Dad. Thank you for giving me this chance. That night, Thao stood by the window looking at the city shining with lights. She was no longer afraid or doubtful. The past was closed and the future was in her hands. She thought of her biological mother, whom she had never met, and whispered, Mom, I have found my way. I hope you will be proud. A gentle wind blew by as if carrying comfort from afar. Finally, Thao sat down at the table and wrote a short letter to Mrs. Lei. Dear Mom, I have found where I belong, but I will never forget you, the one who gave me a home when I needed it most. I love you. She folded the letter, put it in the envelope, and smiled. Her life was no longer a mystery. It was a story with sad chapters, painful chapters, but in the end, a happy chapter. Thao stood up, walked out onto the balcony, and breathed in the fresh air. She knew that no matter what her past was, she had found herself again. And from now on, she would live not only for herself, but also for those who loved her. A few months after officially becoming the project manager at Donghai Group, Thao had gradually gotten used to the busy pace of life. She often worked late into the night, researching new strategies and meeting with the management team. Under Mr. Kang's guidance, she not only learned how to lead, but also developed her own style, combining his decisiveness with her sharp intuition. The market expansion project she was in charge of achieved impressive results, earning her recognition from both employees and partners. One morning, while Thao was reviewing a progress report at the office, her assistant Minyan walked in with a slightly tense expression. Miss Thao, there is someone who wants to see you, Minyan said, her voice hesitant. He claims to be your mother's lawyer, your biological mother. Thao paused, her pen falling to the table. Biological mother? She repeated, her voice filled with surprise. But my mother passed away a long time ago. Mr. Kong said so. Minyan nodded, holding out a business card. He said there was an important matter related to her will. I don't know if I should let him in. Thao took the business card, reading the words, Lu Van Hung, chief lawyer, Hung Fat Law Firm. A feeling of unease rose in her heart. Mr. Kong had said that her mother had passed away after she had gone missing, but had never mentioned specific details. Was he hiding something from her? Let him in, she said, her voice firm even as her heart pounded. She needed to know the truth again. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man walked in, looking serious in a gray suit. He shook Tao's hand, his voice low. Hello, Miss Thao. I am Lei Van Hung, the legal representative of Miss Tran Noklan, your biological mother. Thao nodded, inviting him to sit. Mr. Hung said my mother passed away more than 20 years ago. If you are her lawyer, why are you only appearing now? She asked directly, not hiding her doubts. Mr. Hung sighed, taking out a thick document from his briefcase. I understand your skepticism. The truth is that Ms. Nelkon did not pass away immediately after you went missing, as Mr. Kang might have said. She lived a few more years, but in a state of severe mental breakdown. She passed away 15 years ago, and before she died, she made a will, assigning me the task of finding you when the time was right. Thao felt her head spinning. So, why didn't you come to me sooner? She asked, her voice trembling. Ms. Nyaklian asked me to contact you only when you were an adult and capable of making your own decisions, Mr. Hung explained. She knew she couldn't take care of you after what happened, and she didn't want you to get caught up in trouble when you were young. I've been watching you from afar through the public information, and now that you're settled in Donghai, I think it's time. He pushed the document toward her. Here's her will, along with a letter she wrote to you. Thao took the document, her hand shaking slightly. She opened the letter first, reading the slanted lines from her biological mother. My dear Jiabao, if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer in this world. I am sorry for not being able to protect you, not being able to be with you when you needed me the most. The day you went missing, half of my heart died. I tried to find you, but all the clues led to a dead end. I left you a small gift, a small house in Dalat, where I dreamed of living with you and your father. Come there if you want, and please forgive me. I love you forever. Your mother, Honglan. Tao's tears rolled down her cheeks. She did not remember her mother, but these lines were like a bridge connecting her to the woman she had never met. The house in Dalat, she asked Mr. Hung, her voice choked. He nodded. Yes. She also left a small amount of money in her bank account. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She wanted you to use it to start over if you needed it. Thao was silent, thinking about what she had just heard. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the city. Her mother was not just a distant memory. She had tried to protect her in her own way, although unsuccessfully. But this also raised a big question. Why did Mr. Hung say that her mother had died right after the disappearance? Did he not know the truth, or was he deliberately hiding it from her? That evening, Thao went to see Mr. Kang at his home. He was reading a book in the living room, surprised to see her suddenly appear. Thao, what happened that you came so late? He asked, putting down the book. Hao sat opposite, placing her mother's letter on the table. Dad, I need you to tell me the truth. My mother did not die right after I was kidnapped, right? Why did you lie to me? Mr. Kang looked at the letter, his face paled slightly. He sighed, his voice low. I didn't lie to hurt you. After you went missing, your mother was devastated. She left home, cutting off contact with me. I heard that she passed away a few years later, but I didn't know how she lived during that time. I didn't want you to be heartbroken knowing that she lived alone like that, so I just said she died earlier. He bowed his head, his eyes apologetic. I'm sorry, Thao. I just wanted to protect you. Thao looked at him, feeling a mixture of anger and sympathy. I understand, she finally said, but from now on, I want you to tell me the truth, no matter what. Mr. Kang nodded, holding her hand. I promise. A few days later, Thao decided to go to Dalat to visit the house her mother left behind. She went with Mrs. Lei, who was eager to accompany her on this special trip. When she arrived, she was amazed by a small wooden house in the middle of a valley, surrounded by lush green pine forests. Inside, everything was kept the same as when her mother was alive. Small paintings, a few old books, and a family photo. Mr. Kang, her mother, and her as a little girl. Thao stood in front of the photo, tears falling silently. I'm back, Mom, she whispered. Mrs. Lee hugged her from behind, her voice warm. Your mother will be so happy to see you here. Thao nodded, feeling a connection with the mother she had never known. She decided to keep the house, not sell it, as a place to return to whenever she needed to find peace. Back in the city, Thao continued her work with new energy. She used the money her mother left to sponsor a scholarship fund for orphans, a way to remember her mother and give back what she had received from life. In Donghai, she gradually asserted her position not only as Mr. Kang's daughter, but as a true leader. One day, while standing on stage and speaking to the entire staff, she said, I used to be a girl who didn't know who she was, but now I know I belong here, with my family, with my friends, and with myself. Tao's story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, opening up endless possibilities. She has reclaimed her past, reconciled with the present, and is ready for the future. With her gold earrings, silver bracelet, and house in Dalat, she carries the love of her two mothers and the trust of her father, walking on the path she has chosen for herself. Ladies and gentlemen, Dao's story is complete here. We hope you have found inspiration in her journey, a journey of truth, forgiveness, and self-discovery. Thank you for joining us, and see you again in the next stories.